Good afternoon, everybody. This is the third part of this series, which was devoted in the celebration of the 2,500 years from the Battle of Thermopylae and Salamis. The previous two events on the discussions on Monday and Wednesday, they were devoted to the Battle of Thermopylae. And we had exceptional speakers with us, and we had very interesting discussions speaking not only about the facts, but also about the symbolism, the meaning, what it means, devotion to duty, sacrifice, defending of our values, stay true to ourselves despite all odds, against all odds. This is the second part, the third series, the third instance of the series, but the second part of the discussion. And it's not about the symbolism of sacrifice. It's about the real thing. Thermopylae was a military defeat and a victory as far as symbolism and values. Her Salamis was the real victory. Victory in strategic terms, military terms, victory in strategic terms, in both ways. Before, I have to say Salamis is one of the most fascinating parts of ancient Greek history as far as I am concerned. But of course, we have with us here a distinguished professor who knows much more than I think I do, and he can explain everything to us. Professor Barry Strauss. He's a professor of history and classics at Cornell University and an expert on ancient military history and leadership. He has written and edited numerous books on the classics, including The Battle of Salamis, The Naval Encounter That Saved Greece, and Western Civilization. This was one of the books that was named the Best Books of 2004, and this is the focus of today's conversation. Professor Barry Strauss is also the host of the podcast Antiquitas, Leaders and Legends of the Ancient World, where you can learn all about the distinguished leaders and the most important battles of the ancient Greek and Roman times. Professor Strauss, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us. Now I'll turn the floor to Thanos Davelis to take over the conversation. Thanos.
Thank you, Ambassador, and welcome again, Professor Strauss, to our HALC programming. As many of you know, we've held book events with Professor Strauss in the past, specifically on the Battle of Salamis. And he's graciously joined our podcast a couple of times now to discuss his books, 10 Caesars, The Trojan War, A New History, and many more topics. Barry, it's great to have you back.
Thank you, Thanos, and thank you, Ambassador. I'm honored to be here.
So as our previous two events, the Ambassador laid them out to you, we featured discussions on the Spartans, specifically on King Leonidas and the Battle of Thermopylae. And we had guests including Stephen Pressfield, the author of Gates of Fire, and Professor Paul Cartledge, who's covered the battle from a historical perspective. But there's another crucial player in the story of the Persian Wars, and that's Athens, which had already fought off the Persians once at the Battle of Marathon, 10 years before Thermopylae. As we build our conversation to the ultimate Battle of Salamis, can you give us some background on Athens after Marathon and why this city featured so prominently in Xerxes' mind as he prepared to invade Greece?
Sure, I'll do that. Happy to do that. I should say that Cartledge and Pressfield are so impressive. Hard acts to follow. But right. So, yeah, Marathon was a victory for the Athenian infantrymen, for the Athenian hoplite phalanx. And it had a political impact in that sense. The infantrymen in Athens represented sort of the middle and upper class of Athenian society. And as far as they were concerned, they were the future of Athens militarily. And they thought that they could be relied on to defend the country. I think it was very unwelcome news for them that there was a politician and a great strategist who saw things differently, and that was Themistocles. He himself was also one of these infantrymen and had fought at Marathon, but he didn't share the consensus view that the Persian threat was over and that it had been solved by the Athenian infantrymen. Instead, he believed that the Persians were going to come back and that this time it would be necessary to build a navy to save Athens. And that was politically problematic. It was very visionary of him. Of course, he was right. Politically problematic for two reasons. First, navies are very expensive. And secondly, the Navy would not be staffed by the same class of people who had fought in the infantry army. The Navy would be rowed by the poor. And this would inevitably give them political power. That wasn't all that welcome to the people who served in the infantry. So it was a political fight in order to get the Navy. And probably wouldn't have happened if not for a stroke of luck. There were silver mines in ancient Athens at Lavrion or Laurium, and there was a great strike of silver found. Most politicians wanted to take the proceeds and distribute them among the Athenian people, but it was Themistocles who argued that it should be used instead to build a great navy, and he won the day. This was in 483 BC, so 7 years after Marathon, and 3 years before Xerxes' invasion.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the man Themistocles? Obviously, he's the driving force behind turning Athens into a naval power, and he's got a number of obstacles that he faces. I'd like some more detail on what some of those obstacles were, how did he overcome them, and tell us a little bit about his ambition and his broad vision for Athens, because undoubtedly, I think he's the main character in this story, the Battle of Salamis and the story of Athens emerging from, as you described it, he turned Athens from a backwater into Greece's leading naval power.
Yeah, I mean, Themistocles. Themistocles is an unforgettable character. He's one of the most interesting figures, I think, in ancient history, and a very important figure in military history, in the history of democracy, for that matter. He is an expert politician. He's very ambitious. You know, it was said that he couldn't get over the fact that he had not been number one at Marathon. Miltiades, of course, was, and he wanted to achieve primacy in politics. He also had a vision for Athens, that Athens was going to be a great power, that it could be the greatest power in Greece, and challenge what power that had been number one up to this time, Sparta. He also saw Athens as a great democracy and believed the Navy would contribute that as well. And he saw Athens as a player on, if you will, the international stage. In a world that was dominated by Persia, he thought that Athens could play a real role. So he was a great strategic thinker and a great visionary, but also just an expert at politics, at political communication, and a fabulous tactician, someone who knew what you had to do in order to navigate the dangerous shoals of Athenian politics, and was able to do what it would take to get ahead.
Can you give us a sense of what was going on in Greece and in Athens specifically in the lead up to Xerxes' invasion? So we have the debates that took place where Themistocles won the day and was able to essentially have his way and push Athens to become a naval power. Can you give us a sense of what were the debates going on in Athens, in Sparta, between the city-states in Greece as they saw Xerxes build up his force to invade?
Sure. Well, the first question for many Greek city-states was, were they going to resist Xerxes? And the fact of the matter is that most Greek city-states answered that in the negative. They really thought it was impossible to stop Xerxes. And probably for the Greek city-states in the north, they were right. It probably was impossible to stop Xerxes. But for those in central and southern Greece, there was a real possibility. Still, only 31 Greek city-states in the end joined together in the Hellenic League to resist the Persian invasion. There is no doubt that Sparta, as the most experienced and most prestigious military power in Greece, would be the leader of the Hellenic League. And the Greeks needed the Spartan land army, by far the best land army in Greece, to play the central role in any resistance to Persia on land. Athens had the navy, and the Greeks needed that navy as well. But Themistocles knew that Athens could not vie for being the number one power, that it had to bow to Sparta's reputation. So Themistocles couldn't be the leader of the force, but he had to influence to his vision as well.
Was Athens' role as an emerging power a little? Did it cause concern amongst the other Greek city-states as well? Is that why the Athenians weren't given the primacy to lead the navy, instead it was given to a Spartan?
Yes, I mean, the other Greek city-states were suspicious of Athens and jealous of Athens. Athens had a long history of war, in particular with Aegina, but Athens was also a rival of Corinth. And so these other Greek city-states were not eager to make Athens the leader. They were very suspicious of Athens and what it was up to, particularly with this great new navy that it had. So the Athenians had to face hostility, but the Greek city-states in general were mostly known for fighting each other. It was a very quarrelsome society, and it took a lot of effort to get them to agree to join together in this league, particularly when the threat was just so overwhelming.
So we've covered some of these decisions, these monumental decisions that were made in Athens. And I think it's important to note that these decisions were taken in a democratic Athens and in a city where the democracy was actually relatively young at that point. Can you give us a little bit of insight into the important role that this relatively novel form of government in the ancient world at that time played in fueling Athenian ingenuity and its decision to resist the way that it did? And can you kind of give us a contrast between what this Athenian democracy looked like when we compare it to Sparta and to the Persian model of governance?
Sure. So, democracy was only about 30 years old at the time of Xerxes' invasion. So it was still new. It was a revolutionary form of government. It had come to Athens through a revolution, through a violent revolution. And like many successful violent revolutions, that fuels ambition on the part of the leaders, and they want to export their revolution. Herodotus says that democracy made the Athenians fight better, because previously, when they'd been living under a tyranny, they fought like men who were working under a master. But once they were free, they felt they were invested in the way they fought, and they fought all the better. I think democracy, we can't really imagine Athens agreeing to Themistocles' strategy without a democracy, because without a democracy, there would not have been the political support to give power to ordinary people, which was the inevitable result of the navy. Also, not to be forgotten, was part 2 of Themistocles' strategy called for the evacuation of the homeland, and for the Athenians to move lock, stock, and barrel to various places around the Saronic Gulf. No oligarchy could have carried that out. I don't think a tyranny could have carried it out either. You needed buy-in from the people. This was going to have to be a ground-up movement. Even then, it wasn't easy to do, and it wasn't easy to persuade people. And we can talk about that as well. But I think it's a sign of the dynamism, the innovative nature of Athenian democracy, the revolutionary nature, that they would do something like this, create this fleet, and have this national mobilization to survive and to succeed.
And we will get to that development and that monumental decision, I think, to pick up and leave their city, which I think probably was unheard of at the time, for an entire city to get up and leave and go over. Obviously they went to Salamis, but before that happened, we mentioned the league that had developed the system of alliances of Greek cities that decided to fight the Persians, and the land forces obviously made their stand at Thermopylae. And that's, for those who want the details on that, they should look at our previous 2 series in this that we had this week with Stephen Pressfield and with Paul Cartledge. But at Thermopylae, it wasn't just simply an operation on land. There was an important role for the Greek Navy to play, and it was maybe the first time that the Navy worked together against the Persians. Can you tell us a little bit about the stand of the Greek fleet at Artemisium, which is not too far from Thermopylae? How much did this battle influenced Salamis in terms of the losses for the Persian fleet and the morale for the Greeks? And that's actually a question that we just got from one of our listeners, Michael Konidaris, and I'll pull it up on the screen.
Sure. So it's a great question. So as you say, the Greeks made a coordinated stand in central Greece, not just the land army at Thermopylae, but also the navy at Artemisium. In fact, in a way, they committed more at Artemisium than they did at Thermopylae because the army at Thermopylae was pretty small. The navy at Artemisium was about 275 ships, 275 warships against the Persian fleet. Xerxes' invasion was a joint land, sea invasion, military and naval. And so the Greek resistance was also military and naval. The object at Artemisium was, first of all, to protect the land army at Thermopylae and prevent the Persians from being able to land ships at Thermopylae. Secondly, the Greeks wanted to have experience of fighting the Persians. They hadn't done so before, or at least not since the Battle of Lade in the Ionian Revolt on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea. But they wanted to test this new fleet against the Persians. And the test went very well. There were 3 separate engagements. And the Greeks tried innovative tactics in these engagements, and they inflicted real damage on the Persian fleet. I don't think we could call this a tactical victory for the Greeks because the Persians inflicted damage as well. But it certainly was a strategic victory. It slowed the Persians down, and it gave the Greeks the experience and the self-confidence they'd need to fight at Salamis. They also were quite lucky because the Persians adopted a very silly strategy. They sent a substantial detachment of their fleet, 200 ships around the island of Euboea, around Evia, on the eastern side, where there is an absence of good harbors and real danger from the wind. And in fact, this fleet was destroyed by a storm. It's a great benefit for the Greeks as well.
There's a couple instances actually where there's the one you just described, and a previous one where a storm damaged the Persian fleet quite significantly. How important were these natural disasters in giving the Greeks an edge?
Right, very important. I mean, as we know, there is a very strong north wind in the Aegean in the summer, Miltemi, and it seems almost incredible that the Persians would launch such a large fleet and think that they could get away with it. So there was a storm before this. Earlier, there was a storm further north in central Greece, which also destroyed a significant number of Persian warships. So that by the time the Battle of Salamis was fought, the Persians probably only had about 700 ships. And they had well over 1,000 when they started out. So very significant, these events.
So the pass at Thermopylae falls after Ephialtes betrays the Spartans and the Greeks that were defending the line. And it opens the path for the Persian army to descend into the rest of Greece. And obviously Xerxes has his eye on Athens. He heads towards Athens. And I think you mentioned how incredible it was that the entire city was able to pick up and move to Salamis, and that was actually a democratic decision that was made. And just like the decision that was made to invest in the Navy wasn't an easy one to take, this one was, again, not easy, and it was done in democratic ways to get everybody's consensus on an agreement to do it. And I think this question comes now from one of our listeners, and in the book you explain how there are a number of political rivalries in Athens that are set aside and sacrificed for the good of the city-state, for the good of Athens as the national emergency approaches. And one example that's raised by our listener is that of Cimon, who I'll let you get into the story of what Cimon did exactly. But do you see a lesson in statesmanship there for today's leaders?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, so Cimon is the leader of the aristocratic party in Athenian politics, or the oligarchic party. He's not a He's a supporter of the armed infantrymen of the upper classes, as opposed to Themistocles, who takes a side with the lower classes. Cimon would not have been in favor of building this great navy, and yet he recognizes the national emergency, and he ostentatiously dedicates the bridle of his horse in a temple, in a temple, to show that he's putting aside his preference to be a cavalryman, to fight on land, in a moment of national emergency, when the only way to save Athens is to fight at sea. He knows that in doing so, it might cost him politically. Perhaps he'll be able to, at some point, say, look, I did the right thing for Athens then, so you should trust me now. But he also knows this is really going to help his rival Themistocles. I think the lesson there is that unity is necessary when the nation is in danger. Disunity can be disastrous. It can bring states down. Of course, the great example of that is Athens in the Peloponnesian War, where Thucydides, in his fantastic book, argues that it was disunity, division, that brought the Athenians down and made the Athenians lose the Peloponnesian War. So Cimon's gesture before the Battle of Salamis is just the opposite, and definitely a lesson for today.
The debate that led up to the evacuation featured an interesting discussion about how the Athenians should be best defending themselves, and they had consulted the oracle. And always in ancient history, you have stories of somebody visiting the oracle and it giving you an answer that could work either way. So it's up for interpretation. Can you tell us a little bit about what the debate was like when the Athenians were trying to decide, should we go to Salamis or not?
Yes. So the oracle at Delphi, of course, famously gave Delphic answers. And the oracle told the Athenians to trust in the wooden walls. And the question is, what does that mean? There were some who said that this means the Athenians should make a stand on the Acropolis, which is a natural fortress, and that they should surround it with wooden walls, and they could beat the Persians off there and protect the temples of their gods, which were, of course, immensely important to them. Themistocles' point of view was, no, we need to evacuate our homeland, and the wooden walls are the walls of our ships. It refers to our fleet. Themistocles won, but he didn't win entirely. There were a small group of Athenians that did stay in Athens, and they did build a palisade on the Acropolis. The other thing is that Themistocles, in order to convince the Athenians to really leave their homes, he had to resort to tricks. He had to bring in religion, so the oracle wasn't enough. He also had to get the priest of Athena to say that the snake of the goddess had refused to eat the offering that was given to her, and also to bring in various divine apparitions that supposedly were telling the Athenians they had to go. So the Athenians were resistant. It was a democratic decision, but a little bit of trickery was necessary. And Themistocles understood the importance of information warfare. Modern practitioners have nothing on him. He already knew how to do it.
Give us a little bit more of that propaganda war that Themistocles was playing. What was it like? Because I know there are scenes in the book that you've written, Battle of Salamis, where you describe how he was using it, for example, to create discord among the Greeks that were fighting on the Persian side as well.
Well, yes. So after Artemisium, when the Greeks had to withdraw from Artemisium, Themistocles said to the other commanders, look, there's a lot of Greeks who are fighting on the Persian side. Persia controlled an enormous number of Greek cities, and there were Greek divisions in the Persian navy, Greek squadrons in the Persian navy, and Greek rowers and sailors. And Themistocles said many of them are unhappy about this. They really don't want to be under the thumb of the Persians. And so as the Greek fleet sailed south from Artemisium through the channel between Evia and the mainland, they would leave messages. They would put up messages, propaganda, if you will, to the Greeks fighting in the Persian navy. You know, you're our brethren. You're on our side. Do what you can to trip the Persians up. And remember that we're all Greeks. So yes, that was part of part of his information campaign as well.
So we have the evacuation. The Athenians are all on Salamis, and we're nearing the battle. We're building up to the battle in this discussion as well.
Yeah.
And as they're waiting at Salamis, it's obvious that everyone's not of the same mind. Themistocles and the Athenians want to stay at Salamis and fight
Right.
the naval battle there, and the Peloponnesians and the rest of the allies are looking to essentially leave and defend Greece at the isthmus. They're saying, this part of Greece is lost. We need to head back and save what we've got and shore up the defenses there.
Right.
During the debates, Themistocles has to really deploy all of his persuasive power to convince the Greeks, at least momentarily, to stay. And there's this great scene that you describe where Themistocles is speaking and the other leaders are kind of getting annoyed with him, and the Spartan admiral rises to strike him, and he says, strike me, but listen to me first.
Yeah.
And, I think that quote is fantastic, but it gives you a feel for what the debate was like and how important it was for Themistocles to get his point across. Can you talk about that debate and what is Themistocles arguing with the Greeks?
So Themistocles is, great question. Themistocles hasn't chosen Salamis at random. It's not just that it's close to Athens, and it is close to Athens, but Themistocles' argument is that it offers a unique opportunity to the Greeks. They are outnumbered by the Persians by 2 to 1, at least. And the Persian ships are faster, and they have very experienced commanders. They have, particularly the Phoenician units in the Persian fleet, are extremely good at what they do. The Persians want to fight, and if they're going to fight a naval battle, the Persians want to fight on open water, where they can surround the Greeks, they can cut them off, and they can deploy their speed. If they have to fight in the Salamis Straits, the Persians won't be able to do this. In fact, they'll get crowded. They'll trip each other up. The Greek ships, which are heavier and slower, will suddenly have an advantage because they'll be able to land heavier punches. And that's Themistocles' argument. Nothing doing. It's not working. The other Greeks don't buy it. He threatens them. He says, I have an escape hatch. We have a relationship with a city in southern Italy, the city of Ceres, and we will go there. If you don't agree to this, we'll take our ships and we'll leave, and you will have to fight the Persians without a navy. He also says your plan of building a wall at the isthmus and stopping the Persians there is silly. It's not going to work because they can just take their ships and go around the wall and land their army in the Peloponnesus. But he doesn't persuade them. It doesn't work. The Greeks decide, sorry, we're pulling out.
And that's, I think, where his next move comes in, which is the Masterstroke, I guess, before the battle.
It is the Masterstroke, yes. It is cunning, taking cunning to a new level.
Yeah, and you call him Athens' latter-day Odysseus, which is very fitting. But as you say, he realizes that his efforts aren't working. The Greeks will not stay. So he has to force a battle at Salamis, and he does this by tricking the Persians. Walk us through this trick. What happened?
So he sends a slave, a man, we know his name, named Sikinus. He sends him on a boat to the Persian fleet at Phaleron. And he tells the Persian king, the Greeks are planning to pull out of Salamis tomorrow. But Themistocles of Athens is willing to turn traitor and betray the Greek fleet to you. All you need to do is send your fleet into the Salamis Straits tonight and prevent the Greeks from leaving. You can block their exit. You can block off the straits. And despite getting advice from some of his advisors not to do this, Xerxes takes the bait. He goes for it. And he sends his fleet into the Salamis Straits at night. Now, you can't get all 700 ships in at night. It's only part of the fleet. Moving a fleet at night in ancient times is not an easy thing, but there are plenty of examples that can do it. And so the fleet is launched and they start going into the Salamis Straits at night. Then the news is brought back to the Greeks on Salamis. You can't leave in the morning. There's no longer a way to get out. The Persians have blocked the the Persians have blocked the straits. And so Themistocles has succeeded in forcing everyone's hand. He's tricked the Persians into going into the strait and fighting where he wants them to fight and where it's not advantageous for them to fight. And he's tricked the Greeks, or at least forced the Greeks into having to fight a battle where he wanted to fight the battle.
And that brings us to that morning where they're all prepared and they have to fight. Tell us about the battle. What's it like? Can you describe, I guess, the differences between the ships? I know the Greek triremes played an important role in winning the battle. What was so unique about these ships, and what was unique about Themistocles' battle strategy that makes it still studied today? And
yes, it's a great strategy, and it's a reminder that victory in war doesn't always go to the stronger. Smarts matter, and Themistocles was very smart. So first of all, by getting the Persians to go into the straits at night, he ensures that they're going to be tired in the morning because they have to stay at their ships all night long. And I mean, to do so, you have to have groups of men rowing back and forth during the night, which is tiring. And just simply being on the water if not dizzying, you'll be somewhat upset by being on the water at night. The Greeks are on dry land at night. Secondly, he has the advantage of surprise, even shock, because the Persians expect that when dawn breaks, the Greeks are going to be trying to flee, that Themistocles is going to turn traitor and turn the Athenian squadron. And the Athenians have the biggest squadron in the Greek fleet. They have 180 ships out of the 370 ships that the Greeks have. The Greeks probably even add to it by having the Corinthians pretend to flee to the west. So the Persians really are set up, and they're shocked that actually the Greeks are going to come out to fight. They're not really ready for that. So he's got all of those advantages on his side. An additional advantage that he has is he knows that in the middle of the morning, a sea breeze blows up in the Salamis Straits. And the sea breeze is going to be more of a problem for the Persians than the Greeks, because the Greek ships are lower to the surface of the water. The Persian ships are higher up, and they will catch the breeze, and it will be destabilizing to them. But the main advantage is that he's got the narrow space where he wanted to fight, and he's got surprise, a big force multiplier. And, the sources disagree about exactly how the battle began. An Athenian source says that the Athenians struck the first blow, and a source from Aegina says that the Aeginetans struck the first blow, but soon enough, it's battle on.
And Xerxes is actually watching this battle from a hilltop.
Yes.
That's correct. Right?
Xerxes, he wants to inspire his men both with admiration and fear of what the boss might do. So he's sitting on a throne, supposedly a gilded throne on a hilltop on the mainland, watching the battle take place in the straits below. Of course, they don't have binoculars, and he can't get that clear a view. And he has various servants who are telling him what's going on.
What is he seeing? Can you describe to us what's happening? I know there's a number of individuals that you've mentioned in the book that stand out, and obviously you mentioned who struck the first blow, and there's a mention of a captain from Athens, Amenias, who rams the first Phoenician ship, and then there's Queen Artemisia on the Persian side, who's very impressive in how she handles her ships and how she comports herself during the battle. Can you describe the scene? What's Xerxes seeing?
Okay, so the crucial part of his fleet, the greatest striking force are the Phoenicians, and they are on the Persian right wing. So they're on the left side of the Greek line. On the left side of the Greek line, the Greeks have the Athenians and the Aeginetans. These are their best sailors, their best fighters at sea, and they are ramming the Phoenician ships and doing a lot of damage to them. And Xerxes is seeing this, and he is furious to see the Phoenicians losing. As the Phoenicians and the other Persian ships start losing the battle, they turn and they try to leave the Salamis Straits. Unfortunately for them, they can't do it because the rest of the Persian fleet is still trying to get into the Salamis Straits to join the battle so they can show their king that they fought for the great king of Persia. And what results is one of history's most monumental traffic jams, and deadly, bloody, deadly for the Persians. If Xerxes knows it, if he sees it, one of the victims is his half-brother, Artabignes, the commander of the Persian fleet at sea. He is killed in the battle, probably the greatest coup for the Greeks. But there is also, as you mentioned, the role of Queen Artemisia. So Artemisia is an amazing person. She's half Greek and half Carian, one of the native peoples of Anatolia. And she is the first female admiral in history that we know of. She commands a squadron from her city, from Carian, from Halicarnassus, where she comes from. She's played a role in the Battle of Artemisium. She is an important advisor of Xerxes, and now here she is at Salamis, and she sees an Athenian ship captained by the great Amenius, we mentioned before, Amenius of Pallene. He is heading for her ship. So what does she do? What she does is absolutely fiendish. She rams one of her allied ships, run by a local prince named Damosithamus. Supposedly, he had insulted her earlier. And one story is he'd insulted her earlier, and that maybe she did this to get revenge on Damosithamus. She rams his ship. Amenius sees this and he says, "Oh, I was mistaken. It's not an enemy ship. It must be a Greek ship because it's ramming an enemy ship." And so he leaves Artemisia alone, even though there was a price on her head. He would have gotten a great reward if he had rammed her. Well, the story goes that Xerxes sees this going on, but he's can't quite see what's happening. And so one of his advisors there, who doesn't want to tell the king the truth, says, "Look, master, Artemisia has rammed an enemy ship." And Xerxes, who realizes that they were losing the battle, supposedly says, "Woe is me. My women have become men, and my men have become women."
And the rest of the battle, obviously, as we know, plays out as a huge Greek victory. Give us a little bit of what's the aftermath of the battle like? What happened to the Persian navy? Did it just head back to towards the east? Was it safe for the Athenians to return home again? What's going on after this decisive victory?
So the Persians debate what to do, and they decide that the navy needs to go back pretty quickly to the east, but they're going to leave an army in central Greece, where there are states allied to the Persians. It makes their position more difficult because the purpose of the Persian navy, besides defeating the Greek navy, was also to bring supplies to the Persians. There were lots of Persian supply ships that had come along. So Xerxes goes back and crosses the Aegean, goes back to the east. It's not safe for the Athenians to come home because there's still a Persian army of occupation in Attica and in central Greece. The war is not really decided until the following spring, when a Greek land army, spearheaded by the Spartans, but also including Athenian contingents, defeats the Persian army at the Battle of Plataea, so just north of Attica.
So this battle is obviously very decisive, and I want to frame it in a unique way because you're obviously a contributor to the book. What if the world's foremost military historians imagine what might have been? So I want to use that context to frame how decisive the victory at Salamis was. How would the Persian Wars and the future of Athens and Greece look had Themistocles failed in his efforts to keep the Greeks at Salamis and force that battle with the Persians? And what if the Greeks had lost, even if the battle took place the way that Themistocles wanted it? And this goes back to a question that we got from Pete, who asks, is the Battle of Salamis the most decisive in Hellenic history?
Well, it would be hard to answer that question, but there's certainly a case that can be made that it was. If Themistocles had lost, and if the Greeks did not make a stand at Salamis, no less a source than Herodotus himself says the Persians would have defeated the other Greeks in the Peloponnesus. That means that they would have succeeded in conquering Greece. Now, with luck, a large number of the Athenians would have been able to carry out Themistocles' plan of migrating to Italy. And they might have been able to rebuild Athens and Athenian democracy in southern Italy. That's pretty iffy. The likeliest thing is that Greece would have become a province of the Persian Empire, and it would have been ruled by a series of oligarchies. The Persians had no time for democracy. They liked having local bigwigs to deal with them. There would have been Persian garrisons in Greece, and the whole history of Greece would probably have been very different. The only way it could have reached a result similar to the one that it finally did is if the saving remnant of Athens in southern Italy had managed to rebuild Athenian culture and Athenian democracy there, and if they had managed to spearhead a reconquest of the Greek homeland, then maybe somehow they could have salvaged classical civilization. But that's a pretty thin reed, a pretty unlikely scenario. The likeliest scenario is that classical Greek civilization and everything we owe to it would have been stillborn if the Greeks had lost at Salamis.
And that really puts into perspective just how important this victory was. Without it, I mean, you don't have the golden age of Pericles, obviously no Thucydides, none of the classics as we know them, and you don't have Alexander the Great or a Hellenistic period that follows it. So this is the crucial moment, essentially. Themistocles is our main character. Over the last week, we've had the opportunity to explore two leaders. One is Leonidas, who we talked about him with Stephen Pressfield and with Paul Cartledge, and his leadership of the Spartan forces that went to Thermopylae and their last stand there, her heroism that was displayed. And we also now talk about Themistocles, who I would describe him more as a classic politician with a vision that is thinking long-term and strategic. Can you give us, I mean, you're a leading expert on leadership. Can you compare and contrast these two leaders for us? And kind of, I don't know if you have a favorite. I don't want to make you pick, but give us your view on their leadership roles.
You know, they're each great leaders, but maybe not each entirely someone you'd want to hang around with. I mean, Leonidas is a charismatic warrior who chooses to die for his country. It's an almost Achilles-like decision to win immortal fame by dying on the battlefield, and tremendously important in inspiring Greek resistance to the Persians. In his own way, he was as much of an information warrior as Themistocles was. But I suspect if you were to have dinner with Leonidas, you wouldn't find him an easygoing companion. I think there'd just be something almost divine about Leonidas and really very, very, very separate from ordinary people. Themistocles is a politician. He'd be a glad-hander. I think he'd be a fine person to have dinner with, but you wouldn't really trust him. You know, when Themistocles sends the message to Xerxes that he's going to betray the Greek fleet, you can't help wondering in the back of your mind, well, maybe he would have if he had no other choice. In the end, you know, Themistocles is exiled from Athens, and he's the other Greeks turn on him, and to save his life, he ends up going to the Persian court. And he spends the last part of his life as a governor of a Persian province. He's a servant of the Persian king. It's absolutely wild to think about that. that someone who had done so much damage to the Persians ends up working for the Persians. I suppose it says good things about the Persians that they were willing to take their support from when they could get it. They weren't very picky. But it also tells us what a blood sport politics was in Athens and in Greece in this period, and just how Machiavellian Themistocles was in playing it.
So, Barry, I want to close out with a couple of questions. We just got one in from one of our listeners who asked if the book that you wrote, Battle of Salamis, was used as a reference in making the latest movie with Artemisia starring Eva Green. And did Artemisia and Themistocles meet as this movie portrayed?
Did they actually meet?
Did they actually meet? Because I think that's portrayed in the film. But
yeah, I mean, that's poetic license. We don't have any historical evidence that they met, but it's not impossible to think that they could have met, especially when Themistocles goes to work for the Persian king. Yeah, I think they could have met, certainly.
And one more question before we close out. One more question from the audience before I close out our program here. But
sure.
This one's from Michael Conidadis, who asked that even though democracy was already established in Athens, as we talked about, it was the lower classes that you alluded to who were the ones at the oars, and it wasn't the upper class hoplites or knights that were responsible for the victory, essentially. How did this battle change the political situation in Athens moving forward? Did it give democracy a new wind in the sails?
Yes, great question. It certainly did give democracy a new wind in the sails. It greatly increased the clout of ordinary and poor people in Athens because they were the backbone of the victory. Not only that, after the Persian War, the Athenians go on to establish a naval confederacy, which later becomes an empire. And again, it depends on the poor. So it makes Athenian democracy a much more radical government, a much more thoroughgoing democracy, to the disgust of many in the upper classes. So the political consequences, in addition to the geostrategic consequences of the Battle of Salamis, are absolutely enormous. And we owe, I think, the Western debate about democracy, the Western tradition of criticizing democracy, really is owed to this battle and the legacy of this battle.
Last question from the audience here. We keep speaking, but we get good ones that are coming in.
Absolutely.
This one's from Endy Zemenides, who asks, would you agree that Themistocles is the MVP of the Persian Wars?
Yes, I like that way of putting it. I would agree that Themistocles is the MVP of the Persian Wars. I mean, in Herodotus, Leonidas is the emotional center for Herodotus. I mean, the story of Thermopylae is the absolute emotional high point of Herodotus. Salamis is very serious and grave, but not kind of on the same level. But Leonidas is the Achilles. It's Odysseus who takes Troy. And likewise, it's Themistocles who wins the war. Maybe he's not quite as charismatic a hero, but he's the guy who makes it happen. Without him, there's no victory. So yeah, definitely the MVP of the Persian Wars.
So for all our fans of ancient history that are listening, if you haven't picked up the Battle of Salamis, I'm going to bring it up into the screen right here, cover my face a little bit. But if you haven't picked it up, I highly recommend it and urge you to get it and read the book. And read all of Professor Strauss's works as well. I know on our podcast, we've done great interviews on a recent book, 10 Caesars, and as well on your book on the Trojan War. And they're all must-reads. But Barry, tell us a little bit, what's next for you? Are you working on anything new for us?
Yes. So I'm writing a book now on maybe the second most famous naval battle that took place in the waters of Greece, and that is ancient Greece, and that is the Battle of Actium between Antony and Cleopatra on the one hand, and Octavian, who became Augustus, on the other. It's about the battle. It's about the war that preceded the battle and followed the battle, the conflict between East and West, in which Greece was at the center. So that's the main thing occupying my research agenda and writing agenda at the moment.
And we're excited to get it finally when it comes out and read it. And if you haven't, I know the ambassador mentioned Professor Strauss's podcast. Make sure that you check that out and read it. and get all that you can from Professor Strauss in terms of the knowledge that he offers, because it's definitely invaluable, and you will be able to learn a lot on the ancient world, on the classics, and it's quite astonishing what you can find out on leadership, whether it's Achilles and the Homeric figures that you've discussed on the podcast, to Themistocles and Leonidas, and moving on into the Roman history and further. So pick up 10 Caesars, pick up some of the books. It looks like we've lost Ambassador Papadopoulou in our feed.
I can hear you. I cannot see you, but I can hear you.
So we'll let you pass the parting words to our Ambassador Papadopoulou to close out our series. Hopefully we can get the camera fixed, but everybody can hear you, so we'll have your audio on.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Thank you, Thano. It was an amazing presentation and very informative. I don't want to dwell and say anything more about the importance of the Battle of Salamis because the professor explained it very well. For me, what's fascinating is Themistocles as a personality. We all speak about Athens, the glory of Athens, the unique political system of Athens, the classical achievements, the achievements of classical Athens, and we all associate them with Pericles. But at the bottom, at the base of everything like that was Themistocles and his genius. Themistocles combined unique characteristics. He was a political master, but also he was a military genius. He combined these two characteristics that are not so easy to find. He managed militarily to see where victory was possible, what he had to do to have a military victory, but at the same time he had the political mastery to persuade the people, and not always in an open way, sometimes using deceit, sometimes interpreting the Oracle of Delphi dictum in the way that suited him, but he managed. What also I admire in him is the faith he had in himself, the power of his conviction. This was amazing. Against all odds, he believed in what he thought, in what his opinion was, and he pushed it to the end. And his end also, his physical end as a human being, is so characteristic of a Greek drama. He fought for Greece. He offered classical Athens the biggest victory. He opened the way to become classical, and still he ended up in exile. And even in exile, he found a way to survive. He found a way to adapt, but nevertheless, he died in exile. So in this whole story, the whole drama, the Salamis battle, you have the human aspect of the leader. You had the political lessons of how you unite a people to achieve the goals, uniting even the opponents of the political opponents, and also the military genius to achieve this. And of course, the end result, which is what we know characterized as a classical civilization. So it was an amazing time in history. And thank you so much, Professor, for presenting this to us in such a way. And of course, thanks to Thano for how he managed the conversation. It was an interesting series of discussions about Thermopylae and Salamis, and I'm grateful.
Thank you again, Ambassador. And thank you for the partnership from the Embassy of Greece in Washington for helping us put this together. Really appreciate it, and we look forward to doing more things together. Professor Strauss, thank you again. And for everybody if anybody missed this series, make sure you can check it out on YouTube. You can head on our Facebook page and find all of the interviews that we've conducted. And if you're just tuning in, soon the whole episode will be up with Professor Strauss, so you can catch anything that you missed at any time. Thank you, everybody. And that closes out this session. Stay tuned for more events from HALC. Thank you.
you.